Let's talk about Henry Thoreau's proposal for the good life, which we'll call intellectual life. Our ancient and medieval authors all propose some intellectual aspect to the good life. Socrates proposes the examined life. Aquinas and Aristotle propose the contemplative life. For many of us, these proposals are perhaps doubtful. They seem out of reach, especially the contemplative life. And we can even ask, is contemplating something that we do? Henry Thoreau will propose what I think is a better plan for an intellectual life, one that is more inclusive and allows more possibilities for a life dedicated to thinking. We'll call it the intellectual life. And by intellectual, we don't mean like a life dedicated to scholarly learning only. We mean intellectual in the broad sense of a life committed to thinking and truth and discovery. Let's first establish that Henry Thoreau tells us this in chapters 1 through 3 of Walden. The first place where Henry Thoreau refers to his interests is on page 61. Having simplified his living, he writes, "The whole of my winters, as well as most of my summers, I had free and clear for study." I love that quote for anybody who's a student. On page 85 of chapter 2 is a great statement for Philosophy 225. Henry Thoreau writing, "Shams and delusions are esteemed for soundest truths, while reality is fabulous. If men would steadily observe realities only, and not allow themselves to be deluded, life, to compare it with such things as we know, would be like a fairy tale." I love that statement for our class because I think it's a beautiful way of talking about a life dedicated to truth and knowledge. Similarly, at the top of chapter 3, on page 88, our author writes, "With a little more deliberation in the choice of their pursuits, all men would perhaps become essentially students and observers. In accumulating property for ourselves or our posterity, in founding a family or a state, or acquiring fame even, we are mortal. But in dealing with the truth, we are immortal." That reminds me of Aristotle's statement in the Nicomachean Ethics, Folio C, that the contemplative life is an immortal life. Oh, and then finally, there's a nice short statement of the intellectual life on page 86 in chapter 2. Henry Thoreau writing, "Let us spend our lives in conceiving then." A nice short statement of the intellectual life. Let's now hear a definition or a short definition of the intellectual life. It is human life committed to discovery and truth. And as there are many kinds of discovery and many kinds of truth, there are going to be different kinds of intellectual lives. Some examples of intellectual lives. We've of course seen the proposal of Aristotle and Aquinas for the contemplative life. I think for us today, more commonly, we know that there are many scientists who spent their entire lives in pursuit of scientific truths. Biologists, physicists, geologists, chemists. They pursue a life dedicated to scientific discovery. There are many famous educators who committed their lives to learning and discovery at schools and universities. So the life committed to education is an intellectual life. And many artists pursue art that is committed to thinking and making good judgments and wondering and contemplating. The artistic life, I think, belongs to the category of intellectual life. So, for example, the life of a musical composer or the life of a novelist and writer like Henry Thoreau. So in short, the advantage of Henry Thoreau's proposal is that it contains many possibilities rather than that one specific plan of the ancient world, the contemplative life. Let's review now the ingredients of Henry Thoreau's intellectual life, in other words, what he himself pursued. And he's careful to tell us, you, my reader, may have another calling, something different from me, but I'll share with you what I do to fulfill my life. And most of these ideas are in chapters 1 through 3 of Walden. Well, first of all, our author thinks it's important to practice deliberating about my living. I need to simplify my living so that it doesn't overwhelm and preoccupy me. So that's an important step for Henry Thoreau's intellectual life. We've introduced ourselves to Henry Thoreau's cherished enterprise, something which he feels called to do, and we know that it is broadly nature study and specifically phenology, the study of appearances and emergences indicating seasonal changes. And we've noticed that for Henry Thoreau there are many sub-activities that go into nature study: recording, observing, wondering, and all sorts of activities are referred to in chapters 1 through 3. Our author's telling us that he contemplates, our author's telling us that he practices scientific observing, and he also refers to just his immediate sense of the world around him. Having simplified his living and putting himself by the pond, his sense of reality is sharp and clear in a way that's not possible in the civilized world. In chapter 3, a very specific intellectual activity is advocated for. He refers to it as serious reading. This is where Henry Thoreau is like Aristotle, the book reader. Henry Thoreau tells us that he spends time carefully, meticulously studying the great books of the ancient world and also sacred scriptures of the world. And he thinks that this is something we're missing out on because of our preoccupations with our living. This activity fits into the broad topic of the intellectual life. So let's hear a long definition of the intellectual life, one that expresses the diversity that's possible. Intellectual life, according to Henry Thoreau, is human life 100% committed to some or all areas of intellectual activity and virtue.